The sound of horses thundering across the prairie had haunted her dreams for months, but this time it wasn't a nightmare. Sarah's bare feet hit the cold ground as she clutched the small bundle containing everything she owned. Behind her, the wooden cabin that had been both shelter and prison for 3 years groaned in the wind. Ahead lay nothing but endless darkness and the slim hope that somewhere in the vast wilderness, freedom waited. She had heard whispers around the settlement about the Lakota camps beyond the ridge, stories that painted them as either savage enemies or unlikely allies depending on who told the tale. Tonight, with her forced husband's return imminent and his threats still ringing in her ears, Sarah would discover which version was true. Her choice was simple: face certain brutality at the hands of the outlaw who claimed to own her, or risk everything on the possibility that strangers might show more mercy than the man who called himself her husband. The moon disappeared behind a cloud as Sarah took her first step toward an uncertain destiny, unaware that her decision would not only save her life, but forge an unlikely alliance that would challenge everything both cultures believed about each other. Sarah Elizabeth Turner pressed her back against the rough bark of the old oak tree, her heart hammering so loudly she was certain it would give her away. The night air carried the familiar sounds of the frontier settlement, but tonight those sounds felt different, more threatening. Every creak of wood, every rustle of leaves, made her freeze with terror that Jake Murdoch had returned early from his latest robbery. 3 years had passed since that awful day when her parents died of fever, leaving her alone and vulnerable. Jake had appeared like some dark angel, offering protection and shelter to a grief-stricken 17-year-old girl who had nowhere else to turn. What he hadn't mentioned was the price of his protection. Within a week of moving into his cabin on the outskirts of the settlement, Jake had declared them married in a ceremony that consisted of nothing more than his word and the threat of violence if she disagreed. The settlement folks knew what Jake was, knew about the banks he robbed and the men he'd killed, but they were too afraid to interfere. Sheriff Coleman was either bored off or too scared to act, and the few decent people in town avoided eye contact whenever they saw Sarah in the general store, her face often bearing the purple evidence of Jake's temper. Tonight was different, though. Earlier that afternoon, Mrs. Henderson from the dry goods store had whispered urgent words while pretending to help Sarah choose fabric. Jake had been seen riding hard toward the settlement with his gang, their saddlebags heavy with what looked like fresh loot. But more importantly, she'd heard them talking about Sarah, about how Jake was planning to rent her out to his men for extra money now that the law was getting too close, and they needed to lay low for a while. The thought made Sarah's stomach turn, and she gripped her small bundle tighter. Inside were the few precious items she'd managed to gather: her mother's silver locket, a photograph of her parents, some dried meat she'd hidden away, and the small kitchen knife she'd sharpened to a razor edge. It wasn't much, but it was all she could manage without arousing suspicion. She had been planning this escape for weeks, ever since she'd overheard Jake telling his partner Crazy Pete about his new plans for her. The idea of running into the wilderness terrified her, but not as much as staying did. The stories about the Lakota camps were probably just rumors anyway, tales told around fires to scare children. But even if they were true, even if she encountered hostile warriors, it couldn't be worse than what awaited her in that cabin. The sound of approaching horses made her blood freeze. Through the darkness, she could make out the shapes of 3 riders coming down the main trail. Jake's distinctive laugh carried on the night air, and Sarah knew her time had run out. She waited until they passed, heading toward the cabin, then slipped from her hiding place and began moving toward the tree line. Every step felt like it might be her last as a free person. The dry grass crunched under her feet despite her efforts to move silently. Behind her, she could hear the horses being tied up, and the rough voices of the men as they discovered the empty cabin. Jake's roar of rage when he realized she was gone sent birds scattering from the trees around her. Sarah ran then, abandoning any attempt at stealth for speed. The forest swallowed her up, branches tearing at her dress and scratching her face as she pushed through the underbrush. She could hear them behind her now, their voices growing closer as they organized a search. Jake knew these woods almost as well as she did, and he had 2 other men to help track her down. The terrain grew rougher as she climbed toward the ridge. Her lungs burned and her legs felt like they might give out, but she forced herself to keep going. Somewhere behind her, a dog was barking, and her heart sank as she realized Jake must have brought Brutus, his hunting hound. The massive dog could track a scent for miles, and Sarah knew she had maybe an hour before he found her trail. She needed water, something to throw off the scent. Her desperate mind tried to remember what her father had told her about the streams that ran through these hills. There was supposed to be a creek that flowed down from the high country, but in the darkness, everything looked the same. The sound of running water reached her ears just as her strength was about to give out completely. Sarah stumbled toward it, nearly falling into the creek in her exhaustion. The water was shockingly cold, but she forced herself to wade upstream, hoping to confuse the dog's tracking ability. The rocks were slippery under her feet, and twice she almost fell, but she kept going until she was sure she'd traveled at least a quarter mile along the stream bed. When she finally climbed out of the water on the far side, Sarah was shivering uncontrollably. Her dress clung to her like a second skin, and her teeth chattered so hard she was afraid the sound might give her away. But she was alive, and she was free, at least for now. The landscape had changed during her flight. The familiar woods of her childhood were gone, replaced by something wilder and more primitive. Tall pines stretched toward the sky, their branches creating a canopy so thick that very little moonlight penetrated to the forest floor. Strange sounds echoed through the darkness, calls of animals she couldn't identify. Sarah found a fallen log to rest against and tried to get her bearings. According to the stories she'd heard, the Lakota camps were supposed to be somewhere in this direction, beyond the high ridge that marked the end of what most white settlers considered safe territory. But the stories varied wildly about exactly where these camps might be, and whether the people there would help a desperate white woman or simply kill her on sight. The cold was becoming a serious problem. Her wet clothes were stealing precious body heat, and she knew that exposure could kill her just as surely as Jake's bullets. She needed to find shelter, and she needed to find it soon. The bundle she carried contained no blanket, no extra clothes, nothing that could help her survive a night in the open. As she struggled to her feet and continued climbing, Sarah tried not to think about what she was walking away from. The cabin had been a prison, but it had also been warm and dry. Jake was a monster, but he had fed her and given her a roof over her head. Now she had nothing but the hope that somewhere in this wilderness she might find people willing to help a stranger. The ridge loomed ahead of her, darker than the sky around it. Every step up the steep slope was agony, but Sarah forced herself to continue. Behind her, she could still hear occasional shouts as her pursuers searched for her trail. The dog hadn't found the creek yet, but she knew it was only a matter of time. Near the top of the ridge, Sarah's foot caught on something and she tumbled forward, scraping her hands and knees on the rough ground. When she looked back to see what had tripped her, she found herself staring at something that made her blood run cold. Embedded in the earth was what looked like the remains of an arrow, its wooden shaft weathered but still recognizable. She had entered territory where two worlds collided, where the careful boundaries maintained by both sides meant nothing. From here on, she was truly on her own, with no law to protect her and no familiar landmarks to guide her way. The realization was terrifying, but it was also strangely liberating. For the first time in 3 years, Sarah Turner was the only one making decisions about her life. The view from the ridgetop took her breath away. Spread out below her was a vast valley, silver in the moonlight and dotted with what looked like a river winding through its center. Somewhere down there, if the stories were true, she would find the answers she needed. Whether those answers meant salvation or death remained to be seen. Sarah took one last look back toward the world she was leaving behind, then started down the far side of the ridge into whatever future awaited her in the valley below. The morning sun found Sarah huddled beneath a cluster of pine trees, her body racked with shivers that had nothing to do with the cold. She had managed to descend halfway into the valley before exhaustion finally claimed her, but sleep had been fitful and filled with nightmares. Every sound in the darkness had seemed like approaching danger, whether from Jake's search party or from whatever creatures called this wilderness home. Her stomach cramped with hunger as she forced herself to stand and assess her situation. The dried meat in her bundle was barely enough for one small meal, and she had no idea how to find food in this unfamiliar territory. The creek she'd used to throw off her scent the night before was nowhere to be seen, and her mouth felt as dry as desert sand. The valley looked different in daylight, less mysterious but somehow more intimidating. It stretched for miles in every direction, covered with grasslands that rippled like an ocean in the morning breeze. The river she'd seen from the ridge was clearly visible now, cutting a serpentine path through the center of the valley floor. If there were people living here, they would need to be near water, which meant following the river was her best option. Sarah gathered her meager belongings and started walking, keeping the river on her left as a guide. Her feet, still tender from the previous night's flight, protested with every step, but she forced herself to maintain a steady pace. Somewhere behind her, Jake and his men might still be tracking her, and she couldn't afford to rest until she found help, or confirmed that no help existed. The landscape was unlike anything she'd ever seen. The grass grew higher than her waist in places, creating a green ocean that seemed to extend forever. Strange birds called from hidden perches, and occasionally she caught glimpses of small animals darting through the undergrowth. Everything about this place spoke of a world untouched by the kind of civilization she'd known. By mid-morning, the sun was growing uncomfortably warm, and Sarah's wet dress from the night before had finally dried into wrinkled, uncomfortable folds. Her lips were cracking from thirst, and she knew she needed to reach the river soon or risk serious dehydration. The problem was that the river seemed much farther away than it had looked from the ridge. It was the horse that saved her life, though she didn't realize it at the time. The animal appeared suddenly from behind a low hill, a magnificent painted stallion that froze when it saw her. For a moment, woman and horse stared at each other across the grassland, both equally surprised by the encounter. Then Sarah noticed something that made her heart skip a beat. There were marks on the horse's flanks, decorations that could only have been made by human hands. The rider appeared a moment later, cresting the same hill with an easy grace that spoke of a lifetime spent in the saddle. Sarah's first instinct was to run, but her legs refused to obey. She stood frozen in the tall grass, watching as the figure approached with careful deliberation. This was the moment she'd been both hoping for and dreading since she started her desperate flight. The man who rode toward her was unlike anyone she'd ever seen. His skin was bronze from years under the sun, and his long black hair was adorned with feathers and beads that caught the morning light. He wore what appeared to be buckskin clothing that moved with him like a second skin, and across his back was strapped a bow that looked both beautiful and deadly. When he was close enough for her to see his eyes, Sarah felt a strange calm settle over her. There was no cruelty in that gaze, no immediate threat. Instead, she saw curiosity and perhaps a hint of concern. The man said something in a language she didn't understand, his voice deep and musical. When she didn't respond, he tried again, this time in broken English. "You lost," he said, though it sounded more like a statement than a question. Sarah nodded, not trusting her voice to work properly. The man studied her for a long moment, taking in her torn dress, her scratched face, and the desperate exhaustion that must have been written in every line of her body. When he spoke again, his English was clearer, as if he was remembering words he hadn't used in some time. "Why you here? This not place for white woman alone." The question hung in the air between them, and Sarah realized this was the moment that would determine everything. She could lie, try to make up some story that didn't involve outlaws and forced marriage, but something in the man's manner suggested he would see through any deception. Instead, she found herself telling the truth. "I'm running away," she said, her voice barely above a whisper, "from men who want to hurt me." The warrior's expression didn't change, but something shifted in his posture, a subtle alertness that reminded Sarah she was still very much at this stranger's mercy. He asked more questions then, simple ones that she answered as honestly as she could. Where had she come from? How long had she been traveling? Were the men still following her? Each answer seemed to satisfy him, and gradually, Sarah began to sense that she was being evaluated rather than interrogated. When she mentioned Jake and what he'd planned to do to her, the man's jaw tightened in what looked like anger, though she couldn't tell if that anger was directed at Jake or at her for bringing trouble into his territory. "My name is Lakota," he said finally. "It means friend to everyone. You understand friend?" Sarah nodded eagerly, hope beginning to bloom in her chest for the first time since her escape began. "My name is Sarah." Sarah Turner. Lakota repeated her name slowly, as if testing the unfamiliar sounds. Then he made a decision that would change both their lives. He swung down from his horse and approached her on foot, moving slowly so as not to frighten her further. When he was close enough, he offered her his water skin. The first taste of water was like a miracle. Sarah had to force herself not to drink too much too quickly, knowing that her empty stomach might rebel. As she drank, Lakota studied the horizon behind her, his eyes scanning for any sign of pursuit. Whatever he saw or didn't see seemed to reassure him. "You come with me," he said when she handed back the water skin. "My people decide what to do." The word people sent a chill through Sarah's body. She had hoped to find one sympathetic individual, but the idea of facing an entire group of strangers was terrifying. Lakota seemed to sense her fear because he added something that surprised her. "You safe with us. We not hurt women and children, not even white women who bring trouble." The last part of his statement wasn't entirely reassuring, but Sarah knew she had no other choice. Jake was probably still hunting for her, and she couldn't survive alone in this wilderness. Whatever happened with Dakota's people had to be better than what awaited her if she was recaptured. Dakota helped her mount his horse, settling her in front of him where she would be secure during the ride. The painted stallion was larger than any horse she'd ever been on, but it moved with surprising gentleness under its master's guidance. As they rode toward whatever destination Dakota had in mind, Sarah tried to process everything that had happened in the last few hours. She was riding across an unknown valley with a Lakota warrior, heading toward a camp full of people who might view her as anything from a curiosity to a threat. Behind her, the world she'd known for 20 years was already feeling like a distant memory. Ahead lay uncertainty, but for the first time since her parents died, that uncertainty felt like hope rather than despair. The ride gave her time to observe her rescuer more carefully. Dakota sat his horse like he'd been born to it, every movement fluid and natural. He spoke occasionally, pointing out landmarks and sharing simple observations about the country they were passing through. His English was better than she'd first thought, though he sometimes struggled to find the right words. When she asked how he'd learned to speak her language, Dakota told her about traders who sometimes visited his people and about a winter he'd spent with a trapper who'd been caught in a blizzard and needed help. The story revealed a complexity to the situation that Sarah hadn't expected. These weren't the savage enemies of the settlement stories, but people who made their own decisions about when to help and when to fight. As they traveled deeper into the valley, Sarah began to see signs of habitation. Trails worn by many horses crossed their path, and in the distance she could make out what looked like smoke rising from cooking fires. The reality of her situation was becoming clearer with every mile. She was about to enter a world completely foreign to everything she'd ever known, dependent on the kindness of strangers who had every reason to distrust her. But as frightening as that prospect was, it was still better than being Jake Murdoch's property. Whatever challenges lay ahead, Sarah Turner was finally free to face them on her own terms, and that knowledge gave her strength she didn't know she possessed. The Lakota camp emerged from the landscape like something from a dream. One moment Sarah and Dakota were riding through empty grassland, and the next they were approaching a collection of white teepees arranged in careful patterns along the riverbank. Smoke rose from dozens of cooking fires, and the sound of voices speaking in the musical language she'd heard Dakota use filled the air. Sarah's grip tightened on the horse's mane, as curious faces turned to watch their approach. Children stopped their games to stare at the strange white woman riding with one of their warriors. Women paused in their work to whisper among themselves, and men emerged from their lodges to assess this unexpected development. The weight of all those eyes made Sarah feel smaller than she'd ever felt in her life. Dakota seemed untroubled by the attention. He guided his horse through the camp with confident ease, stopping occasionally to speak with various people in their own language. Sarah couldn't understand the words, but she recognized the tone of explanation and reassurance. Whatever Dakota was telling them, it seemed to calm some of the initial tension his arrival with a white woman had created. They stopped in front of a large teepee that was distinguished from the others by intricate decorations and what appeared to be symbols of authority. An elderly man emerged, his presence commanding immediate respect from everyone nearby. His weathered face was impassive as he studied Sarah, but his eyes held an intelligence that suggested he was evaluating far more than her appearance. Dakota dismounted and helped Sarah down, then engaged in a lengthy conversation with the elder. The discussion was conducted entirely in Lakota, leaving Sarah to stand awkwardly beside the horse while her fate was decided by people she couldn't understand. She caught her own name mentioned several times, along with words that sounded like they might refer to her desperate flight from Jake. Other people gathered around as the conversation continued. Sarah noticed that the women seemed particularly interested in her condition, taking in her torn dress, her scratched face, and the exhaustion that still clung to her like a shadow. One woman, middle-aged, with kind eyes and graying hair braided with colorful beads, approached and began examining Sarah's injuries with gentle efficiency. The woman spoke softly in English, her accent thick but understandable. "I am Ayana. It means eternal blossom. You hurt much?" Sarah nodded, grateful to hear words she could understand. "I'm hurt, but I'll be fine. Thank you for your kindness." Ayana smiled at the formal politeness and began cleaning the scratches on Sarah's face with water from a buffalo horn cup. "Dakota say you run from bad men. Say you have no place to go." The simple statement brought tears to Sarah's eyes. She had been holding herself together through sheer willpower, but the combination of safety and kindness was threatening to overwhelm her carefully maintained composure. "I didn't know where else to go. I heard that your people might help me." "We help," Ayana said with certainty that surprised Sarah. "But first, Council must decide. You understand, Council?" Sarah nodded, though she wasn't entirely sure she did understand. In her world, decisions were made by individuals or small groups of powerful men. The idea that an entire community might have a say in her fate was both reassuring and terrifying. The elder who had been talking with Dakota approached them, his expression still unreadable. When he spoke, his English was much better than Sarah had expected, suggesting years of contact with white traders and settlers. "I am Chief Macpia Lutak, which means Red Cloud in your language. Dakota has told me of your situation, but I must hear your words as well. Will you speak truthfully of why you are here?" The question was fair, and Sarah found herself grateful for the opportunity to tell her own story. She began with her parents' death and Jake's false offer of protection, describing the 3 years of captivity and abuse that had led to her desperate escape. She spoke of Jake's plans to rent her to his men, and her decision that even death in the wilderness was preferable to that fate. As she talked, more people gathered to listen. Sarah realized she was telling her story not just to the chief, but to an entire community that would have to live with the consequences of whatever decision they made about her. The responsibility of that was almost overwhelming. When she finished, Chief Red Cloud asked several pointed questions about Jake and his men. How many were there? What weapons did they carry? How likely were they to follow her into Lakota territory? Sarah answered as honestly as she could, though she admitted she couldn't be sure about Jake's intentions. She knew he was possessive and violent, but she didn't know if his pride would drive him to risk a confrontation with the Lakota. The chief listened carefully to her answers, then called for the council meeting that would determine her fate. Sarah was led to a place near Ayana's lodge where she could rest while the discussion took place. The waiting was almost unbearable, but she tried to occupy herself by observing the camp around her. What she saw challenged every preconception she'd carried about these people. The camp was organized and peaceful, with clear evidence of a complex society that valued both individual skill and community cooperation. Children played games that required strategy and skill, while adults engaged in activities that ranged from practical crafts to what appeared to be artistic expression. The women in particular fascinated her. They moved through the camp with confidence and purpose, their voices clearly valued in the discussions that seemed to be taking place in many lodges. This was very different from the white settlements she knew, where women's opinions were rarely sought on important matters. Ayana brought her food during the wait, a thick stew made with meat and vegetables that Sarah didn't recognize but found delicious. As she ate, Ayana explained some of what was happening in the council meeting. "Some say you bring danger," Ayana admitted. "White women here mean white men come looking. Maybe mean trouble for all of us." Sarah's heart sank. She had hoped that her desperate situation would inspire sympathy, but she hadn't fully considered how her presence might endanger the people she was asking for help. "But Dakota speak for you," Ayana continued. "Say you good woman with bad situation. Say the men who hurt you are not all white men, just bad men." This important difference, the distinction seemed crucial, and Sarah was grateful that Dakota had understood her situation well enough to present it in terms his people could understand. She wasn't asking them to trust all white people, just to help one woman who had nowhere else to turn. As the afternoon wore on, Sarah began to understand that the council process was more complex than she'd initially realized. It wasn't just about her immediate fate, but about how her presence might affect the delicate balance the tribe maintained with the outside world. They lived in a territory that was increasingly pressured by white expansion, and every decision had to be weighed against the potential consequences for the entire community. When the sun was beginning to set, Dakota approached her with Chief Red Cloud and several other men who appeared to be senior members of the tribe. The expression on Dakota's face was carefully neutral, giving Sarah no hint about what decision had been reached. Chief Red Cloud spoke first, his voice formal but not unkind. "The council has decided. You may stay with us until the immediate danger passes. Ayana will teach you our ways so you do not give offense through ignorance. But you must understand, this is not a permanent solution. When it is safe, you must decide what path your life will take." Relief flooded through Sarah so powerfully that her knees nearly buckled. She had been granted sanctuary, at least temporarily. It wasn't a complete solution to her problems, but it was hope. And that was more than she dared to expect when she fled into the wilderness. "There are conditions," the chief continued. "You will work to support yourself while you are here. You will respect our customs and our people. And if the men who pursue you threaten our safety, you will leave immediately, even if it means facing them alone." Sarah nodded eagerly, accepting every condition without hesitation. She would have agreed to almost anything for the chance to sleep safely and eat regularly while she figured out what to do with the rest of her life. As the formal meeting ended and people began to disperse, Takeda remained behind to speak with her privately. You understand what this means? He asked. My people take risk for you. You must be worthy of that risk. I understand, Sarah replied. I'll do whatever I can to prove that your faith in me is justified. Lakota studied her for a moment, then nodded as if satisfied with what he saw. Tomorrow you begin learning. Tonight you rest and heal. But remember, you are guest here, not prisoner. Very different thing. As night fell over the camp and Sarah prepared to sleep in safety for the first time in years, she reflected on how much her world had changed in just 24 hours. She was still a woman alone in a dangerous world, but now she was surrounded by people who had chosen to help her despite the risks. It was a kindness she had never expected to receive, and one she was determined to prove worthy of, no matter what challenges lay ahead. Sarah's education in Lakota life began before dawn on her second day in the camp. Ayana gently shook her awake as the eastern sky showed the first hints of grey and handed her a set of clothes that were unlike anything she'd ever worn. The soft buckskin dress was decorated with intricate beadwork and felt like luxury against her skin after years of rough cotton and wool. Today you learn women's work, Ayana explained as she helped Sarah braid her hair in a simple style that would keep it out of her way. Not just work to keep busy, but work that keeps people alive. Very important difference. The distinction became clear as Sarah followed Ayana through the morning routines of the camp. Every task had a purpose that went beyond mere activity. The women gathered by the river not just to collect water, but to share information about the day's plans and any concerns that needed community attention. The preparation of morning meals involved complex decisions about resource allocation and nutrition that required both practical knowledge and social awareness. Sarah's first assignment was helping with the preparation of buffalo hide, a process that was both physically demanding and technically complex. Under the patient guidance of an older woman named Winona, she learned to scrape the hide clean, work it until it became supple, and begin the intricate process of turning raw material into clothing, shelter, or tools. The work was unlike anything she'd ever done. In the settlement, women's tasks had been largely domestic and repetitive. Here, every activity required skill, creativity, and understanding of natural processes that had been refined over generations. Sarah found herself fascinated by the depth of knowledge required for even simple tasks. White women think we just live in wilderness, Winona observed as Sarah struggled with a particularly difficult section of hide. But we make wilderness into home. Big difference. The comment made Sarah reflect on her own assumptions about what constituted civilization. The settlement had seemed advanced because it had wooden buildings and metal tools, but the camp demonstrated a different kind of sophistication. These people had developed sustainable ways of living that worked in harmony with their environment rather than trying to dominate it. Her afternoons were spent learning language and customs. Lakota proved to be a patient teacher, helping her understand not just Lakota words but the concepts behind them. Many ideas that were central to Lakota culture had no direct equivalent in English, requiring Sarah to expand her way of thinking about relationships, responsibility, and community. In your language, you say my horse, my land, my woman, Lakota explained during one lesson. But how can person own another living thing? We say, the horse I care for, the land I protect, the woman who chooses to be with me. Words shape how mind thinks about world. The philosophical differences went deeper than language. Sarah began to understand that she had entered a society organized around principles of reciprocity and mutual responsibility, rather than individual ownership and competition. Everyone had roles and obligations that served the greater good, but these were balanced by rights and freedoms that were protected by the community as a whole. Her position in this system was unique and sometimes uncomfortable. As a guest under the protection of the tribe, she was entitled to food, shelter, and safety, but she was also expected to contribute according to her abilities and to respect customs she was only beginning to understand. The balance between gratitude and independence was delicate, and Sarah found herself constantly aware of the need to prove her worth without overstepping boundaries she couldn't always see clearly. The children of the camp became her most enthusiastic teachers, delighting in her struggles with their language and eagerly correcting her pronunciation of important words. Through their games and stories, Sarah began to understand the values and history that shaped Lakota culture. The children spoke of warriors and wisdom keepers, of harmony with nature and responsibility to future generations. One afternoon, while helping to gather medicinal plants under Ayana's supervision, Sarah encountered her first serious challenge to the temporary peace she'd found. A group of young warriors returned from a scouting expedition with disturbing news. They had seen signs of white men moving through the territory, armed men who didn't appear to be traders or settlers. The news sent ripples of concern through the camp. Chief Red Cloud called for an immediate council meeting, and Sarah found herself once again waiting while others decided her fate. This time, however, she wasn't a complete outsider to the process. Several women approached her to express support, and even some of the men who had initially been skeptical of her presence acknowledged that she had been working hard to prove herself worthy of the tribe's protection. When Lakota came to find her after the council meeting, his expression was serious but not grim. "The men my scouts saw might be the ones who follow you," he said. "Council decide to send watchers to learn more. If these men threaten camp, we deal with them. But you should know, not all council members happy about fighting white men over white women." The weight of responsibility settled heavily on Sarah's shoulders. She had hoped that Jake would give up his pursuit after a few days, but she should have known better. His pride and his possessiveness wouldn't let him accept that she had escaped his control. Now her problems were becoming problems for people who had shown her nothing but kindness. "What can I do?" she asked. "I can't let innocent people get hurt because of me." Lakota studied her face carefully before answering. "You can trust us to protect what is ours. You are under our protection now, which makes you one of what is ours. But you can also prepare yourself to be useful if trouble comes." The next few days took on an urgency that hadn't existed before. Sarah's lessons expanded to include basic skills that might be needed if the camp had to move quickly or defend itself. She learned to pack essential supplies efficiently, to recognize the warning signals that might indicate approaching danger, and to handle tasks that would free up more experienced people for fighting if necessary. More importantly, she began to understand her place in the complex network of relationships that held the community together. The women who had initially been polite but distant started including her in conversations about camp matters. The men began acknowledging her with nods of recognition rather than merely tolerating her presence. Children sought her out for the stories she could tell about the world beyond their territory. The change was subtle but significant. Sarah was no longer just a refugee seeking temporary shelter. She was becoming part of the community, with all the rights and responsibilities that entailed. The transformation was both empowering and terrifying, because it meant that what happened to the camp would happen to her as well. When the scouts returned with confirmation that the armed white men were indeed searching for something or someone, the camp's response was swift and decisive. Chief Red Cloud called for a gathering of all adult members to discuss their options. For the first time since her arrival, Sarah was included in such a meeting as a matter of right rather than as a courtesy. The discussion was conducted primarily in Lakota, but Lakota translated the essential points for her benefit. The consensus seemed to be that the camp would not be intimidated by a few outlaws, but that precautions needed to be taken to protect the most vulnerable members of the community. "We could send you away," Chief Red Cloud said to Sarah directly. "Make you face these men alone, as original agreement said. Some think this is wisest course." Sarah's heart clenched, but she forced herself to meet the chief's eyes steadily. "I understand why some would think that. But I hope you'll give me a chance to help defend what has become my home too." The chief's expression didn't change, but something shifted in the atmosphere of the gathering. Other voices began to speak up, and Sarah realized that people were arguing on her behalf. Ayana spoke passionately about Sarah's contributions to the women's work. Takoda described her efforts to learn their ways and respect their customs. Even some of the children spoke up about the stories and gains she had shared with them. When the discussion finally ended, Chief Red Cloud's decision reflected the complexity of the situation. "You will stay," he told Sarah, "but not as guest seeking protection. You will stay as member of community who helps protect all members. You understand difference?" Sarah understood perfectly. She was no longer asking for charity or temporary shelter. She was being offered a place in a society that valued her contributions and expected her to share in its risks. It was an honor she had never expected, and a responsibility she was determined to prove worthy of. As the meeting dispersed, and people began preparing for whatever conflict might come, Sarah reflected on how profoundly her life had changed. 3 weeks ago, she had been a prisoner with no control over her own fate. Now she was a valued member of a community that was willing to fight to protect her freedom. The irony wasn't lost on her that she had found more acceptance and respect among people her own culture considered savages than she had ever known among her own kind. But as she prepared to face the challenges ahead, Sarah realized that such ironies were just another lesson in the education she was receiving about what really mattered in life. The confrontation came on a morning when the autumn air carried the first hint of winter's approach. Sarah was helping Ayana prepare medicinal supplies when the sound of approaching horses echoed across the valley. The lookouts had been expecting this moment for days, but the reality of it still sent a chill of fear through the entire camp. 3 riders approached under the white flag of parley, their guns visible but not immediately threatening. Sarah recognized Jake's distinctive silhouette long before she could make out his face, and the sight of him made her stomach clench with remembered terror. Beside him rode Crazy Pete and a third man she didn't recognize, all of them looking dangerous and out of place in the peaceful setting of the camp. Chief Red Cloud emerged from his lodge wearing the ceremonial clothing that marked him as the tribe's official spokesman. Lakota and several other warriors flanked him, their weapons clearly visible as a reminder that the peaceful approach could change quickly if necessary. Sarah found herself surrounded by the women and children, protected but also positioned where she could witness whatever negotiations were about to take place. Jake's voice carried across the camp as he demanded the return of his property. His words were crude and dismissive, treating Sarah like a piece of livestock that had wandered away from its rightful owner. The casual arrogance in his tone made Sarah grateful for the distance between them, but it also strengthened her resolve to never again be subjected to his control. Chief Red Cloud's response was delivered in English for the benefit of the visitors, but his tone carried the authority of someone accustomed to being obeyed. The woman you seek has asked for our protection. She claims you have abused her and forced her into marriage against her will. These are serious accusations. Accusations? Jake's laugh was harsh and unpleasant. She's my wife, bought and paid for fair and square. Whatever she told you is just the lies of a hysterical woman. I've come to take back what belongs to me. The exchange that followed revealed the vast gulf between 2 completely different concepts of justice and human relationships. Jake spoke of ownership and legal rights, backing his claims with threats of violence and retribution. Chief Red Cloud spoke of choice and community responsibility, making it clear that Sarah had found sanctuary among people who valued her humanity over any man's claims to possess her. As the conversation continued, Sarah realized that Jake had made a fundamental error in his approach. He had come expecting to intimidate a small group of savages into giving up a white woman rather than risk conflict with civilized men. What he found instead was a leader who was both intelligent and unimpressed by the crude attempt at intimidation. You have no authority here, Chief Red Cloud said finally. This woman has chosen to join our community. We have accepted her choice. If you attempt to take her by force, you will be acting as thieves and kidnappers, and we will respond accordingly. Jake's face darkened with rage at the unexpected resistance. Sarah could see him calculating odds and considering his options, and she recognized the expression that had always preceded his worst violence. But here, surrounded by people who would not tolerate such behavior, his usual tactics were useless. The moment of decision came when Jake tried to push past the warriors to reach Sarah directly. His movement triggered an instant response from the entire camp. Men who had been standing casually alert suddenly became a coordinated force, weapons appearing in hands with practiced efficiency. Women moved protectively around the children while positioning themselves where they could support the defenders if needed. Sarah found herself at the center of a human shield that had formed without any apparent signal or coordination. The people who had taken her in were now literally putting their bodies between her and danger, and the courage of that gesture overwhelmed her with gratitude and determination. You want to take her. Dakota's voice cut through the tension, his English clear and challenging. Then you must go through all of us. You think 3 men with guns can face an entire village of warriors who know this land like their own heartbeat. The odds had shifted dramatically from what Jake had expected. Instead of facing a few intimidated natives, he was looking at a prepared community that was both willing and able to defend itself. More importantly, he was realizing that the woman he'd come to reclaim was no longer the frightened, isolated victim he had controlled for 3 years. Sarah stepped forward then, surprising everyone, including herself, with her calm clarity. Jake, she said, her voice carrying across the space between them. You never owned me. You tricked a grieving girl into believing she needed your protection, but I'm not that girl anymore. These people have shown me what real protection looks like, and it doesn't include fear and violence. You ungrateful bitch, Jake snarled, his mask of civilized authority finally slipping completely. After everything I did for you, this is how you repay me, running off with a bunch of heathens. You did nothing for me except teach me the difference between a prison and a home. Sarah replied, amazed at her own boldness. I'm not leaving with you, Jake. Not today, not ever. The finality in her voice seemed to penetrate Jake's rage-clouded mind. For the first time, he appeared to fully understand that his former victim was beyond his reach, protected by people who would not be intimidated or bought off. The realization triggered a desperation that made him more dangerous than ever. Fine, he said, his voice dropping to the low, menacing tone Sarah remembered too well. But you better remember, these people won't always be around to protect you. And when they're not, I'll be waiting. The threat hung in the air like smoke from a fire that refused to die out completely. Chief Red Cloud's response was delivered with the calm certainty of someone stating an obvious fact. If you return to our territory, you will not leave it alive. This is not a threat. It is information you need to understand your situation clearly. Jake's retreat was reluctant and filled with muttered curses, but it was still a retreat. As the three riders disappeared over the ridge, Sarah felt a mixture of relief and lingering fear. The immediate danger had passed, but she understood that Jake's final threat was not an empty one. He was a man who held grudges, and he would not easily accept defeat. The victory celebration that followed was subdued but meaningful. The community had faced a test of their commitment to protecting Sarah, and they had passed it without compromise. But everyone understood that the threat had been postponed rather than eliminated entirely. In the days that followed, Sarah's integration into the tribe accelerated. Her willingness to stand up to Jake had proven something important to people who valued courage above almost all other qualities. She was no longer a refugee or even a guest, but a full member of the community with all the rights and responsibilities that status entailed. Lakota began teaching her more advanced skills, including basic tracking and self-defense techniques. You cannot always depend on others for protection, he explained. Strong community made of strong individuals who can protect themselves and each other. Ayana included her in the decision-making processes that governed the women's activities, seeking her opinions on matters ranging from food distribution to the education of children. Even Chief Red Cloud began consulting with her about issues that affected the entire camp, recognizing that her knowledge of white culture and motivations could be valuable in dealing with future challenges. As winter approached and the camp prepared for the seasonal migration to more sheltered territory, Sarah reflected on the extraordinary journey that had brought her to this point. She had fled into the wilderness as a desperate woman with nowhere else to turn. She had found not just safety but a new understanding of what it meant to belong to something larger than herself. The woman who had once been Jake Murdoch's prisoner was gone forever, replaced by someone who had learned to value herself through the eyes of people who saw her as a human being rather than property. Sarah Turner had discovered that home was not a place but a feeling, and that family could be created through choice and commitment rather than just blood and tradition. When spring came and the time arrived to decide whether to remain permanently with the tribe or seek a different path, Sarah's choice was clear. She had found her place in the world among people who valued her for who she was, rather than what she could provide. The girl who had once believed she needed a man's protection had become a woman who understood. The true strength came from being part of a community that protected all its members. The threats that had driven her into the wilderness still existed, but they no longer defined her life. Sarah had learned that running away from something terrible could lead to finding something wonderful, and that sometimes the greatest courage was simply refusing to give up hope. In choosing to join the Lakota permanently, she was not just escaping her past, but embracing a future she had helped to create through her own choices and actions. The transformation was complete. The frightened refugee had become a valued member of a community that had given her something she'd never expected to find. A sense of belonging that was based on mutual respect and shared commitment to each other's well-being. It was, she realized, what she had been searching for her entire life without even knowing it existed.